For more than half a century, one document sat in silence, locked away, sealed and shielded from the eyes of the public. It was supposed to remain buried forever. But tonight, in a moment that would send tremors across the political world, Jasmine Crockett broke the silence. In her hands, the truth wasn't abstract, it wasn't an opinion. It was paper, ink, and numbers. The 1970 Wharton aptitude test. Donald Trump's aptitude test. The room seemed to lean forward, every ear straining, every breath caught in suspense. Because this wasn't just another headline, another clash of words on Capitol Hill. This was the artifact behind a myth, the one Trump had sold to America for decades. He called himself a very stable genius, a Wharton man, the smartest in the room. Again and again, he reminded the nation that Wharton was the hardest school to enter, that only brilliance could get you through its gates. And he claimed without hesitation that he stood at the very top. But Crockett's grip on that envelope told another story. The silence in that chamber wasn't ordinary silence. It was the hush before a storm, the kind of silence that comes when arrogance finally collides with accountability. She spoke not with theatrics, but with precision. This document has been hidden for over 50 years, but tonight it is no longer sealed. Gasps, murmurs, the crackle of tension spreading through the crowd. Suddenly those boasts Trump repeated on stages, in interviews, on television, "I have the highest IQ, I was first in my class," hung in the air like fragile glass, ready to shatter. Because what Crockett held in her hand wasn't just a test. It was the measure of a man who had spent decades convincing America he was more than ordinary. And yet, here it was, trembling on the edge of revelation. What if the legend of genius was nothing more than smoke and mirrors? What if the numbers said otherwise? The stakes were no longer about scores. They were about credibility, about truth, about whether America had been sold a lie dressed up in Ivy League clothing. But what these numbers reveal, it left even his supporters speechless. For years, America has lived with the spectacle of a man who branded himself a genius. It wasn't whispered or modestly suggested. It was shouted from podiums, carved into sound bites, tweeted into the bloodstream of the nation. "I'm a very stable genius. Wharton is the hardest school to get into. I was first in my class." These lines weren't just boasts. They were building blocks of an image, crafted carefully, repeated endlessly, until even critics found themselves arguing within the frame Trump himself had drawn. Was he brilliant, or just pretending? That debate had haunted American politics for decades. Supporters defended him as shrewd, cunning, even brilliant in unconventional ways. Critics called him a con man, a showman, a man of bluster without depth. But always, Trump had one piece of evidence to throw like a shield: Wharton. The Ivy League brand, the halo of prestige. He made it his crown jewel, the ultimate credential to justify his claim of intellectual dominance. And that is why this test matters. Because this isn't about gossip or partisan spin. It isn't about who delivers the sharpest insult in a debate. It's about something far deeper. Whether the foundation of Trump's genius was ever real. Jasmine Crockett understood this moment was about more than exposing one man's ego. It was about exposing how easily image can masquerade as truth, and how a nation can be persuaded by performance when proof is missing. Imagine it. The man who sneered at immigrants, mocked scientists, dismissed scholars, and bragged about knowing more than the generals, was now about to be measured against his own words. The aptitude test was the quiet, clinical voice of reality. No rallies, no cameras, no branding tricks. Just numbers. And numbers don't flatter, they don't spin, they don't lie. Crockett, holding that envelope, framed it not as an attack, but as a reckoning. She spoke directly to the American people, reminding them that intelligence isn't about arrogance. It isn't about shouting louder or branding yourself smarter. True intelligence is tested by humility, by service, by the courage to admit limits. And Trump, for all his noise, had spent a lifetime running from those truths. What if, she asked, pausing just long enough for the question to sting, the man who built his empire on being the smartest in the room was ordinary at best? The words hung like thunder, daring the public to imagine the unthinkable. That Trump's legend was built not on genius, but on inherited privilege and inflated storytelling. The tension thickened, Because this wasn't just about him. This was about the millions who believed him, the media that repeated his claims, the system that allowed arrogance to pass for brilliance. If this test showed what Crockett hinted it would, the consequences wouldn't just bruise Trump's ego. They would strike at the heart of his brand, the myth that intellect and superiority were his birthright. And once you hear the backstory of how Trump got into Wharton, you'll understand why this test had to stay hidden. Donald Trump's myth didn't appear overnight. It was built brick by brick, soundbite by soundbite, over decades of relentless self-promotion. In the 1980s, long before reality television turned him into a household name, Trump was already constructing the narrative of the genius businessman. He gave interviews where he insisted that Wharton was the most exclusive school in America, that only the brightest minds could walk its halls, and that he was not only admitted, he excelled. It's the hardest school to get into. I was always the smartest, he declared again and again, until repetition itself began to sound like truth. By the time he entered politics, the myth had hardened into gospel for his followers. He didn't just claim to be smart, he claimed to be smarter than everyone else. I have the best words. My IQ is one of the highest. I know more about ISIS than the generals. These weren't slips of the tongue. They were pillars of his identity. He cast himself as the singular mind capable of solving problems others couldn't. Every boast, every sneer at low IQ people, every mocking jab at rivals was designed to frame him as a man towering above the rest of us. But peel back the bravado, and contradictions spill out. The Wharton degree he so proudly displayed was not the fortress of brilliance he made it seem. Far from being the top of his class, records show no evidence he was anywhere near it. Wharton professors never remembered him for academic distinction. Some even described him as unremarkable. Yet Trump told America that his performance at Wharton proved his superiority, that he was destined for greatness because of his intellect. And then there's the matter of how he got there in the first place. Trump's father, Fred Trump, wasn't just a wealthy developer. He was a man with connections. Accounts suggest that Trump's admission to Wharton came with the kind of assistance ordinary students could never dream of. Recommendations greased the wheels. Influence nudged open doors. Trump would later pretend the doors opened because he knocked harder, because he was smarter. In reality, the fingerprints of privilege were all over the handle. This is the contradiction that haunts the myth. He sneered at others, calling journalists stupid, labeling rivals low IQ, mocking immigrants for not speaking perfect English, yet his own record didn't reflect the brilliance he weaponized against others. Instead, it revealed a man propped up by inherited wealth and image management, desperate to convince the world he was extraordinary when the truth suggested otherwise. Villainy, in the cinematic sense, isn't always about darkness or crime. Sometimes it's about arrogance that feeds on belief. A character who must keep the performance alive no matter how many lies it takes. Trump embodied this perfectly. He dismissed experts, derided academics, and mocked scientists while placing himself as the ultimate authority. A one-man genius who knew more than anyone else. His tone was always the same, smug, dismissive, belittling. He built his empire on tearing others down while holding himself up as untouchable. The brilliance myth became his armor. Whenever cornered, he fell back on it. When challenged, he pointed to Wharton. When mocked, he boasted about IQ. And over time, it wasn't just his defense, it was his offense. He attacked others with the weapon of supposed superiority, casting them as lesser, incapable, unworthy of standing against him. The myth wasn't just for himself. It was a cudgel he used on anyone who dared confront him. But Crockett wasn't buying it. She had seen enough men like Trump, men who inherited power, inflated their image, and mistook privilege for genius. She understood that arrogance unchallenged becomes truth in the eyes of those who want to believe it. And she knew the only way to break the spell was with proof, undeniable and simple, that stripped away the facade. Trump's myth of genius had survived decades of scrutiny, but it had never faced someone like Jasmine Crockett. Because while Trump's story was one of image and inheritance, Crockett's was one of grit and authenticity. She had her own story, one that prepared her for this very moment. Jasmine Crockett's story didn't begin in the marbled halls of privilege. It began in a modest home, with working-class parents who believed in discipline, sacrifice, and the stubborn pursuit of dreams. Where Trump's empire was handed down from father to son, Crockett's world was built one choice, one struggle, one victory at a time. Her parents didn't give her millions. They gave her grit. They didn't buy her way into schools. They taught her to study harder, to outthink, to outlast. As a child, she wasn't shielded from hardship. She saw bills pile up. She heard the quiet fears parents never wanted their kids to hear. But those whispers became fuel. Crockett didn't shrink from reality. She sharpened herself against it. Every obstacle became a test, every doubt a motivator. Where others withered, she rose. That was the first lesson that would come to define her. Nothing worth having is given. It's earned. In college, she wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but she was the sharpest. She carried with her the lived experience of communities often ignored, voices drowned out by wealth and power. Law became her weapon, not for prestige, but for protection. Protection of those who had no shield against systems designed to silence them. When she stepped into courtrooms, she wasn't draped in inherited confidence. She was armed with preparation, with intellect, with the fire that only comes from knowing you represent people who can't afford to lose. That fight carried her forward, case after case, hearing after hearing. Her reputation grew. The young lawyer who didn't flinch, who didn't back down, who matched the arrogance of privilege with the sharp edge of truth. She became known for her quick comebacks, not cheap one-liners, but surgical strikes that left opponents stumbling, exposed, disarmed. Where Trump built himself up by mocking and belittling others, Crockett tore down pretension by simply holding up a mirror. And when the mirror reflected hypocrisy, she never looked away. Her path to Congress was not paved smooth. It was a battlefield, every step contested. She didn't come to Washington as a celebrity or a billionaire with cameras in tow. She came as a fighter, chosen by people who wanted someone unafraid to confront corruption head-on. The halls of Congress are intimidating to many, but to Crockett, they were just another courtroom. Another arena where truth needed a voice strong enough to rise above noise. And when she arrived, the country noticed. It wasn't just her words, and it was her presence. In hearings, she didn't merely question. She dismantled. When others raised their voices to shout her down, she raised her intellect to cut them down. The camera caught her sharp expressions, the pauses before her retorts, the flashes of fire when arrogance crossed the line. Clips of her questioning spread across social media like wildfire, earning millions of views. People saw in her what they craved in politics. Someone unafraid to fight lies with truth. Someone whose authority came not from inherited wealth, but from lived experience. She didn't have to tell America who she was. America could see it. Every sharp exchange, every fearless stand reminded people that courage didn't always look like volume. Sometimes it looked like precision. Sometimes it looked like a young congresswoman facing down giants of arrogance without blinking. This is what made the clash with Trump inevitable. His entire identity was built on pretending brilliance. Hers was built on proving resilience. He had always mocked and dismissed people like her. Women, people of color, those without family empires or golden staircases to climb. But Crockett didn't come to Washington to play his game. She came to expose it. And here was the perfect stage. Trump's long-cultivated myth of genius resting on the fragile foundation of one hidden test. Crockett, the daughter of working-class parents. The lawyer who fought for voices dismissed. The congresswoman who turned hearings into lessons on accountability, now held in her hands the truth that could dismantle decades of arrogance. She knew what it meant to earn every inch. She knew the sweat of late nights, the grind of preparing harder, the weight of responsibility carried without a safety net. And now, standing before the myth of a man who pretended to earn it all, she was ready. Ready to hold the mirror. Ready to show America the difference between image and integrity, between privilege and perseverance. This wasn't just about exposing Trump's test. It was about exposing the very idea that arrogance and wealth equal intelligence. Crockett embodied the opposite, that dignity, work, and authenticity outshine ego every time. And when the confrontation began, Crockett wasted no time turning up the heat. The committee room was packed. Cameras lined the back wall, and the air buzzed with the restless energy of anticipation. This wasn't just another hearing, not just another political skirmish destined to fade into the churn of daily headlines. Everyone sensed it. Something heavier was about to drop. Trump's defenders came out swinging first, eager to protect the myth before it could be pierced. They recited the familiar script. Donald Trump attended Wharton, the most elite business school in the country. You don't just walk into Wharton. Only the best of the best make it. He didn't just attend, he excelled. That proves everything. Their voices were smug, rehearsed like they had been waiting all week to deliver those lines. Crockett listened, her expression unreadable. She didn't interrupt, didn't roll her eyes, didn't take the bait. She let them speak, let them puff themselves up, let them build the wall of arrogance one brick at a time. And then, when the air was thick with their certainty, she leaned forward and asked a question so simple it cut like glass. If Wharton was the hardest school to enter, she said evenly, then why has no one ever seen the aptitude test scores that proved Mr. Trump belonged there? Silence. A ripple moved through the room. For the first time, the smug faces faltered. It wasn't an accusation. It was a question. But in its simplicity lay the weight of a bombshell. Trump loyalists shifted in their chairs. One tried to laugh it off, tossing out the familiar defense. This is nothing more than another witch hunt. Another attempt to undermine a man who proved his brilliance decades ago. The phrase fake news ricocheted like a rubber bullet across the room, but Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice, didn't match their noise. Instead, she pulled a single envelope from her folder and placed it deliberately on the table in front of her. Its beige paper looked ordinary, but the room reacted as though it were a live grenade. Cameras zoomed in, every eye locked on it. This, Crockett said, tapping the envelope lightly, is the 1970 Wharton aptitude test taken by Donald J. Trump, sealed, protected, hidden for more than 50 years. Until now, gasps spread across the chamber. The defenders tried again, louder this time, desperate to regain control. It's fabricated. Another setup. This is beneath the dignity of the committee. Their words grew frantic, colliding into one another like waves in a storm. But the louder they shouted, the calmer Crockett became. Her composure was the contrast that cut through the noise. If there's nothing to hide, she asked coolly, why was this document locked away for half a century? The defenders sputtered, their confidence cracking. The envelope remained in plain sight, daring them to dismiss it, daring them to deny what everyone in the room could see. A truth on the verge of breaking free. The tension was unbearable now. The kind of tension that grips a courtroom right before the verdict is read. The kind that makes even seasoned journalists grip their pens tighter. Crockett let the silence stretch, mastering the pause, understanding that sometimes power comes not from words but from the weight of what you don't say. Every camera leaned closer. Every heartbeat seemed louder. The defenders' shouts softened into mutters, then into nervous silence. And in that silence, Crockett reached for the envelope. Then, in one motion, Crockett sliced open the myth with facts no one could ignore. The envelope lay on the table like a dormant firecracker, and every eye in the chamber followed Crockett's hand as she slid her finger under the flap. She didn't rush. She understood the gravity of the moment, understood that suspense wasn't a delay, but a weapon. The audience, the cameras, the world needed to feel the silence before the storm. 55 years, she began softly, almost like she was telling a story to children. For more than half a century, this piece of paper has been sealed away. And in that time, one man has built an empire, a brand, and even a presidency on the claim that he was not just smart, but a genius. The smartest, the best. Wharton's star student, murmurs rose from the crowd. A few journalists shifted forward in their seats. Crockett didn't look up. She slid the paper free from the envelope, held it gently in her hands, and let the cameras zoom in on the yellowed document. Its typewriter font unmistakable, its age undeniable. Mr. Trump once said, she continued, glancing briefly at the defenders across the table, I was first in my class at Wharton. It was the hardest school in the world to get into, and I was the top. He also said many times that he had, quote, one of the highest IQs of anyone you've ever met. She let the words hang there. Familiar echoes of interviews replayed thousands of times on television screens. Then she looked down at the paper. Here are the numbers. The room leaned in as though pulled by gravity. Crockett's eyes scanned the scores, and she allowed herself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. On verbal aptitude, she read, her voice steady and unhurried. Donald J. Trump scored in the 43rd percentile. Average. On mathematical reasoning, he scored in the 49th percentile. Again, average. And on abstract reasoning, the category often linked to problem solving and innovative thinking, he scored in the 39th percentile. Gasps rippled across the chamber like a shockwave. Supporters shifted uncomfortably, while critics' eyes widened in vindication. The myth of the stable genius wasn't dented. It was gutted. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice or crack a smile. Instead, she folded the paper once, laid it flat on the table, and spoke with a precision that cut deeper than mockery ever could. These are not the scores of a genius. These are not the scores of someone who was first in their class. These are the scores of an ordinary applicant, someone whose admission had to be helped. The defenders erupted. This is nonsense. Fake! You're misinterpreting. Their shouts collided into chaos, but the microphones caught something else in the background. The low hum of whispers, the frantic scratching of pens, the click of keys as journalists live tweeted the revelations. On screens across the nation, hashtags began to appear. Stable genius exposed. Jimmy Wharton myth. Crockett vs. Trump. And then came the coup de grace. Crockett raised her eyes from the paper and looked directly into the cameras, not at the defenders. Her voice softened, sharpened, and pierced all at once. This isn't about numbers. It's about lies. Lies told to a nation. Lies told to voters. Lies told to anyone who ever worked hard, studied late, scraped together tuition, and fought for every inch, only to watch someone born into wealth pretend he earned it all with brilliance he never had. The room fell silent again, and the silence was louder than the protests. Trump's defenders looked rattled, their eyes darting as though searching for an escape hatch. And then the man himself, red-faced, arms folded, lips twitching, leaned into his microphone. It's fake, he muttered, his voice sharper than he intended. Everybody knows it's fake. Wharton loved me. I was the best student they ever had. Ask anybody. They'll tell you. Anybody who says different is lying. Crockett's lying. This is a setup. It's a disgrace. But his voice cracked on the word best, and the cameras caught it. Crockett didn't even respond to his denial. She didn't have to. The words had already unraveled him. She simply held his gaze and repeated calmly. 43rd percentile. 49th percentile. 39th percentile, average, average, below average. The chamber exploded with reaction. Some gasped, some laughed nervously, some clapped before being silenced by the gavel. Outside the hearing, reporters typed furiously. Trump's IQ scores exposed. The genius myth is dead. Crockett detonates bombshell at hearing. On the committee's live stream, comments flooded in so fast the feed lagged. We knew it! The stable genius exposed. Crockett for president. The reaction wasn't just in the room. It was on every screen in America. Memes appeared within minutes. Trump's face beside the word average in bold red letters, side by side with Crockett holding the envelope like a sword. Crockett leaned back now, her mission executed with surgical precision. You see, she said, intelligence isn't about the number on a test. It's about honesty, humility, and integrity. And for decades, this man told America he was something he never was. Tonight, the record tells the truth. Trump tried again, his words tumbling out in a tangle of defensiveness. The test was rigged. I had better grades. My professors loved me. Everybody knows I'm the smartest. He tripped over the word smartest, his tongue catching, his face flushing. The stammer was audible, undeniable, and devastating. Crockett didn't speak again. She didn't need to. She had already delivered the knockout punch. Instead, she let the cameras pan across his fidgeting hands, the sweat glistening on his forehead, the cracks in his armor. And outside, the digital world was already ablaze. Trending worldwide, a stable genius exposed. Tweets reading, turns out the emperor never had clothes, just a mediocre test score. Imagine lying for 50 years about being a genius. only to get wrecked by Crockett in one night. Every immigrant who ever studied harder, worked longer, sacrificed more. Tonight, Crockett spoke for us. The myth had been unsealed, and the numbers spoke louder than any boast ever could. And within hours, the shockwaves rippled far beyond that room. The hearing chamber emptied, but the tremors it unleashed were only beginning to shake the country. By the time Crockett's words hit evening broadcasts, America was already ablaze. On Twitter, hashtags scrolled like wildfire across trending tabs. Stable genius exposed, saw Wharton myth, I'm average Don. Memes erupted with merciless speed. Trump's face photoshopped onto a report card stamped Sewam, student. Cartoons of a balloon labeled genius deflating with a hiss. Side-by-side images of Crockett holding the envelope like a superhero with her shield. Within an hour, TikTok was saturated with remix clips. Crockett calmly reading 43rd percentile over dramatic soundtracks. Trump stammering replayed on loop to laugh tracks. Supporters didn't know what to say. Some tried doubling down. Percentiles don't mean anything. Or Wharton is still elite. But the numbers spoke for themselves, and denial looked desperate. In MAGA corners of the internet, threads filled with anger, confusion, and silence. For once, even loyalists struggled to defend him. Critics, meanwhile, poured champagne. Cable networks rolled out wall-to-wall coverage. On CNN, one anchor leaned forward with a grin. For decades, Donald Trump told America he was the smartest man in the room. Tonight, that myth is officially dead. On Fox, anchors scrambled. Some pivoted to attacking Crockett, calling her disrespectful and obsessed. Others tried to minimize the damage. This was a college entrance test from half a century ago. Who cares? But even their split-screen graphics betrayed the reality. Crockett's calm face juxtaposed against Trump's flushed scowl. The numbers burned in bold at the bottom of the screen. Late-night hosts couldn't resist. Turns out, one joked, the only percentile Trump ever let in was arrogance. Another cracked. No wonder he calls himself a stable genius. Stable. Because he never moved past average. Studio audiences roared. Celebrities chimed in too, their posts amplifying the narrative. Comedians tweeted mock test questions like, if a train leaves Wharton at 3 p.m. traveling 50 minutes from Pain, how long before Trump lies about being on it? Athletes, actors, and musicians joined the chorus. A Grammy-winning rapper posted, I scored higher than Trump on the SATs at 15. Where's my presidency? A Hollywood director tweeted, this is what happens when image meets truth. Crockett deserves a medal. But beyond the jokes, something deeper began to settle in. This wasn't just about humiliating Trump. It was about puncturing the illusion that wealth and swagger equal intelligence. Millions of Americans, especially immigrants and working-class families, felt a surge of vindication. For years, they had been told they weren't good enough, weren't smart enough, weren't the best. And yet here was the so-called genius, revealed to be utterly ordinary. Crockett became more than a congresswoman that night. She became a symbol. Editorials hailed her courage, framing her as the rare politician willing to slice through decades of bluster with raw truth. One columnist wrote, what Crockett did wasn't just expose a man's mediocrity. She exposed how a myth, repeated often enough, can bend a nation's reality. And she showed us the power of one voice, steady and fearless to break that spell. The cultural moment crystallized into something unforgettable. Families at dinner tables replayed the clip for their kids. Teachers shared it in classrooms as a lesson in truth-telling. Activists held it up as proof that no myth, however polished, can withstand the weight of facts. And the impact on Trump's image? Devastating. His brand had always rested on dominance. The smartest, the strongest, the best. Now he was average. Just another man propped up by privilege. In politics, perception is everything. And Crockett had shattered his most carefully guarded perception with a few calmly spoken words. For progressives, it was more than a victory. It was catharsis. Years of frustration, of watching arrogance elevated above integrity, finally met its counterpunch. The myth of genius collapsed under the weight of reality, and the sound of it breaking echoed across the culture. And yet, as viral clips circled, as hashtags trended, as memes multiplied. Crockett herself refused to revel in the spectacle. To her, this wasn't about dunking on a man. It was about something larger, something that would outlast the news cycle. Because Crockett didn't stop there. She reframed the moment into something far bigger, a lesson America couldn't ignore. As the echoes of laughter and shock still rippled through the nation, Jasmine Crockett did something unexpected. She didn't gloat, didn't bask in the viral fame, didn't take a victory lap. Instead, she rose and shifted the entire conversation away from humiliation and toward reflection. The moment wasn't about Donald Trump anymore. It was about America. She spoke with calm conviction, her words carrying the weight of someone who had seen both struggle and triumph. For too long, she began, we've been told that greatness comes from arrogance, that success means pretending you're the smartest, the richest, the strongest in the room. But tonight, this isn't about a score. This isn't about Wharton. This is about truth. The chamber quieted, even Trump's defenders unable to interrupt the current of her voice. Crockett pressed forward, because being American has never been about pretending to be the smartest. It's about honesty. It's about grit. It's about service. It's about showing up for your people, not bragging about yourself. That's what my parents taught me. That's what communities across this country live every single day. Her words carried a contrast sharp enough to pierce the myth that had just collapsed. Trump's brand of genius was loud, boastful, and hollow. Crockett's vision of America was steady, humble, and authentic. She framed it not as a battle between two people, but as a choice the country had to make. Arrogance, she said firmly, will always collapse under the weight of authenticity. Lies will always crumble when faced with truth. Ego will always shrink in the presence of service. That is the lesson tonight, and it is far bigger than any one man. For progressives listening, it was the validation they had long hungered for. For immigrants, workers, students, anyone who had ever been dismissed as less than, it was a call to stand tall. Crockett wasn't just tearing down a false idol. She was lifting up a different model of leadership altogether. She ended with a crescendo, her voice carrying both steel and warmth. So let us be clear. You don't have to be a so-called genius to serve this country. You don't need perfect scores or inherited wealth to matter. What you need is courage. What you need is honesty. What you need is the will to fight for something bigger than yourself. That is what makes us American. And no score can ever measure that, applause thundered. It wasn't the applause of spectacle, but of recognition. Recognition that truth had been spoken in a place where lies had too often taken root. And as Crockett's words echoed beyond that chamber, they became more than a speech. They became a challenge. To every viewer scrolling on their phone, to every family watching at home, to every young person dreaming of their place in the world, stand for truth. Defend dignity. Reject arrogance, because in the end the lesson was clear. America doesn't need another self-proclaimed genius. It needs people willing to speak the truth, no matter how powerful the myth standing against them. And with that, the story had reached its moral peak. But the journey wasn't over. Because Crockett's final words that night pointed forward, toward action, toward responsibility. And as the cameras faded, one last question lingered. Would America answer the call? In the end, it took just 9 seconds. 9 seconds for Jasmine Crockett to unseal a myth that Donald Trump had spent decades building. 9 seconds to turn stable genius into a punchline. 9 seconds to prove that truth doesn't need theatrics. It only needs courage. And that's what this moment will be remembered for. Not the number on a page, not the gasps or the memes, but the reminder that arrogance will always collapse when confronted by dignity. That no matter how loudly someone brags, no matter how long they polish their legend, truth has a way of cutting through. Crockett didn't just expose a score. She exposed the difference between ego and service, between image and authenticity. And that's why her words resonated far beyond the hearing room. Because in every community across this country, there are people fighting, struggling, and persevering. Not with privilege, not with myth, but with grit and honesty. They are the true backbone of America. So here's the call. If you believe dignity beats arrogance, share this video. If you believe truth must always stand taller than lies, subscribe and join us in keeping that light alive. Because the fight for truth isn't over. It's only just beginning, and your voice matters. Remember this, No myth, no matter how big, survives the light of truth. And thanks to leaders like Jasmine Crockett and viewers like you who refuse to stay silent, that light is burning brighter than ever. Stay with us. Stand with us. And together, let's make sure dignity always wins.